Welcome back to the Crime Bull podcast with your boy Bill and your girl Jill, where it's true crime, no bull. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Help us grow. Okay, let's solve some crime. Today we're doing a deep dive on the case of Eric Fitting, a young man murdered in Fall River, Massachusetts back in the early 90s.
Yeah, this case really stuck with me. It's just tragic. A young life cut short and still so many unanswered questions decades later.
Right, and that's what we're here to do, dig into the details and see if we can maybe shed some light on this cold case for our listeners. So let's start with the basics. Who was Eric Fitting?
So Eric was 26 years old at the time of his death, seemed like a pretty popular guy, well-liked in the community, no obvious enemies. The kind of person you wouldn't expect to end up murdered.
And where was he found? I know the source material mentions something about a wooded area.
Yeah, he was found in this pretty dense wooded area just off Route 124. It's not like the middle of nowhere, but it's definitely secluded enough that someone could go unnoticed, especially back then.
So already we're seeing some of the challenges investigators faced. Limited visibility. Probably not a lot of foot traffic in that area.
Exactly. And you have to remember, this was the early 90s. No security cameras, no cell phones to track his movements. It was a much different time in terms of investigation techniques.
So right off the bat, they're dealing with a limited amount of information. And to make matters worse, the source material also mentioned that even Eric's last known whereabouts were unclear.
Yeah, that's a major hurdle in any investigation trying to establish a timeline without knowing where the victim was or who they were with in the hours leading up to their death. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
It definitely makes things more difficult. So what were the initial theories that investigators focused on?
Well, they were looking into all the usual suspects, right? Possible disputes. Maybe Eric was involved in something he shouldn't have been, maybe drugs or some other criminal activity.
Right, they have to consider all angles.
Exactly, but the problem was the lack of evidence. There were no witnesses, no signs of a struggle at the scene, and the physical evidence was very limited.
So no clear motive, no witnesses, and a crime scene that offered very little in terms of usable evidence.
Pretty much, and that's why this case eventually went cold. They just hit a dead end.
But even with the official investigation stalling, I imagine the rumors and speculation must have been running wild, especially in a smaller community like Fall River.
Oh, absolutely. You know how it is, small-town murder mystery, everyone becomes an armchair detective? There were rumors about drug deals gone wrong, old grudges, even some pretty outlandish theories.
Did any of those theories pan out or lead anywhere?
Not that I could find in the research. It seems like a lot of it was just that rumors, people trying to fill in the blanks with whatever they could come up with.
I bet that was incredibly frustrating for Eric's family.
Oh, I'm sure it was. To lose someone you love so suddenly and then to have so many unanswered questions and to see the investigation stall, it's just unimaginable.
It really highlights the devastating ripple effect of these kinds of crimes. It's not just the victim who suffers, the family and the entire community are impacted as well.
Absolutely. It creates the sense of fear and unease. People start looking over their shoulders, wondering if they could be next. And that feeling can linger for a long time.
So this murder really shook the town of Fall River. Can you paint a picture of what the community reaction was like?
Yeah, Fall River is a pretty tight-knit community, and from what I gathered, this crime really rattled people. It wasn't a town used to this kind of violence. So suddenly you have this young man murdered, seemingly out of nowhere. It just sent shockwaves through the community.
People must have been terrified.
Absolutely. The research talked about how parents wouldn't let their kids play outside alone. Everyone was on edge looking over their shoulder. It really shattered that sense of safety and security that people had.
And that feeling of unease probably lingered for quite a while.
Oh, definitely. This wasn't just a crime story. It was a community trauma, and it takes a long time to heal from something like that.
It's heartbreaking to think about. And it really underscores how a single act of violence can completely upend a community.
It's a sobering thought for sure.
So we've talked about the lack of evidence, the impact on the community, but why exactly did this case go cold?
You have to remember, this was the early 90s, right? Forensic technology wasn't what it is today.
So they were really limited in terms of what they could do back then.
Exactly. They relied heavily on eyewitness accounts, physical evidence, and just good old-fashioned detective work. But as we've discussed, this case was lacking in all those areas.
So the trail went cold and the case sat unsolved for years. But I did see something in the research that mentioned some efforts to revive the investigation. Can you tell us a bit more about those?
Yeah, so even though it was officially designated a cold case, it never really went away completely. Detectives periodically revisited the files, hoping that a fresh set of eyes might catch something that was missed the first time around.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just need a new perspective.
Right. And they also re-examine the existing evidence, hoping that advancements in forensic technology might yield some new clues.
Speaking of forensic technology, can you explain for our listeners how those advancements could potentially help solve Eric's case?
Oh, absolutely. DNA technology in particular has been a game changer in so many cold cases. Back in the 90s, they needed a pretty substantial sample of DNA to get a match. But now, with techniques like touch DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, they can work with incredibly small samples, even microscopic traces left behind on clothing or objects.
So even if there wasn't a lot of evidence collected at the time, there's still a chance that some of it could be re-examined using these new technologies and potentially lead to a breakthrough.
Exactly. And even if they don't get a direct hit to a known suspect, they might get a familial DNA match, which could point them in the right direction. Genetic genealogy has been incredibly successful in solving cold cases by identifying distant relatives of suspects, which allows investigators to build out family trees and eventually zero in on a person of interest.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like solving a puzzle by working from the edges inward. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the human side of this story. The source material really highlighted Eric's family and their tireless efforts to keep his memory alive and fight for justice. What can you tell us about their journey?
It's really both heartbreaking and inspiring. They've endured over 2 decades of not knowing who killed their son or why. They've had to grapple with the agonizing uncertainty, the frustration with the lack of progress in the case, and just the deep, unrelenting pain of their loss. And yet, through it all, they've shown incredible strength and determination.
What specifically have they done to keep Eric's case in the spotlight?
Oh, they've given countless interviews, keeping the story alive in the media. They've organized vigils and memorial events to honor Eric and keep his memory alive. They've even been vocal in their criticism of the investigation, pushing law enforcement to do more, to explore new avenues, to never give up on finding the person responsible.
It sounds like they've been relentless in their pursuit of justice, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles.
They really have, and it speaks volumes about their love for Eric and their unwavering belief that his murder can be solved. They haven't allowed themselves to succumb to despair or bitterness. Instead, they've channeled their grief into action, becoming advocates not only for their son, but for all victims of unsolved crimes.
I just got to say, we have the best audience. Shout to all our loyal listeners and fans. You guys really rock. Make sure you like and subscribe. Thanks for being the best. Now back to Eric's family. It's really remarkable to see their dedication. But as you mentioned, there are countless other families out there going through a similar ordeal. What can you tell us about the broader issue of cold cases? How big of a problem is it really?
It's actually a bigger problem than most people realize. According to the FBI, there are tens of thousands of unsolved murders across the country. Each one represents a life cut short, a family left with unanswered questions, and a community grappling with the ripple effects of violence. And while some of these cases eventually get solved, many remain cold for years, even decades.
What factors contribute to a case going cold? Is it always just a matter of insufficient evidence or lack of leads?
I mean, those are definitely major factors, but there are other challenges as well. Witnesses' memories fade over time, physical evidence deteriorates, people move, making them harder to track down. And sometimes it's just a matter of resources. Law enforcement agencies often have limited budgets and personnel, and they have to prioritize cases based on the likelihood of solving them. Cold cases, by their very nature, are challenging and time-consuming, and they may not get the attention they deserve.
So it's not just about finding that one crucial piece of evidence. It's also about having the resources and the manpower to keep these investigations going, even when the trail seems to have run cold.
Exactly. You've hit the nail on the head. Cold cases require a special kind of dedication, both from law enforcement and from the families who refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten.
What gives you hope that these cases can be solved even after all these years?
Well, as we've discussed, advancements in DNA technology are definitely a game changer. But beyond the science, there's the human element. There are dedicated detectives out there who specialize in cold cases, poring over old files, re-interviewing witnesses, chasing down every possible lead. And then there are the families who never give up hope, who keep pushing for answers, who keep their loved ones' stories alive. That combination of scientific progress and human perseverance is what gives me hope.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can endure, and that even when justice seems elusive, the pursuit of truth is never in vain.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that every life has value. and that everyone deserves justice no matter how much time has passed.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you brought that up because I think it's also important for listeners to understand that they can play a role in helping to solve these cold cases.
Really? What can our listeners do? They're not detectives or forensic scientists. What kind of impact can they really have? Well, you'd be surprised. Sometimes even the smallest piece of information can make all the difference. Maybe you remember something from back then, something you saw or heard that didn't seem important at the time. Or maybe you've learned something new over the years that could be relevant to the case. Don't discount anything. Even if it seems insignificant, report it to the authorities.
So if you have any information about Eric Fitting's case, no matter how small or seemingly irrelevant, reach out to the Fall River Police Department. Their contact information is available on their website.
Exactly. You never know, you might hold that one missing piece of the puzzle.
Right. You could be the one to help break this case wide open. And even if you don't have direct information about Eric's case, you can still help by spreading awareness about cold cases in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Share articles, podcasts, documentaries, anything that keeps these stories in the public eye. The more people who are aware of these unsolved crimes, the greater the chance that someone with crucial information will come forward.
So it's all about keeping the conversation going, keeping the pressure on, and never letting these victims be forgotten.
Precisely. And, for listeners who want to go even further, there are organizations that specifically focus on cold cases, providing resources to families, advocating for policy changes, and even funding independent investigations. Supporting those organizations, either financially or through volunteer work, can really make a difference.
It's amazing how even small actions can contribute to something so much bigger than ourselves.
Absolutely.
Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into Eric Fitting's case, I'm left with this mix of emotions. Sadness for the loss of a young life, frustration that his murder remains unsolved, but also a sense of hope that one day justice will prevail.
I share those feelings. But I think what's most important is that we don't let this case or any cold case fade into obscurity. We owe it to the victims and their families to keep searching for answers, to keep fighting for justice, and to never give up hope that even the coldest of cases can be solved.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And for our listeners, as you go about your day, think about Eric Fitting, his family, and all the others who are still waiting for answers. What can you do to make a difference in the fight for justice? Remember, even a small action can have a ripple effect.
Justice delayed shouldn't mean justice denied.
True crime, no bull.